The first time I knew something was terribly wrong, I wasn't looking at the ground. I was looking at the sky. For almost 30 years, every time I turned into my gravel driveway outside the little town of Ashbrook, I could catch the reflection of the afternoon clouds shimmering across the pond that sat near my eastern fence line before I even parked my truck. That afternoon, after spending 4 weeks in northern Michigan helping my older brother recover from heart surgery, there wasn't a single reflection waiting for me. Just a flat sheet of black asphalt baking under the July sun. I actually slowed my truck because I thought I'd somehow taken the wrong road. But the old red barn was still there, my mailbox still leaned the same crooked way it always had, and the giant white oak my late wife used to decorate with lanterns every 4th of July was standing exactly where it belonged. Everything was familiar except the one thing that mattered most. I climbed out of the truck, dropped my overnight bag onto the driveway, and just stood there staring. The pond was gone. Not drained, not dried up, gone. In its place sat a freshly paved parking lot with bright yellow stripes, concrete wheel stops, decorative streetlights, and a brand new wooden sign that read, "Additional resident parking." It looked like it had been there forever, except I knew every inch of that ground, every willow tree they'd ripped out, every rock my grandkids used to jump from into the water, every patch of cattails where ducks nested each spring. Someone hadn't simply changed my property, they'd erased part of my family's history. I walked closer in complete disbelief until I noticed another sign bolted to my fence. It was printed on expensive glossy paper inside a weatherproof frame, almost like they expected me to admire it. It read, "Former water hazard removed as part of the Willow Creek Community Safety Improvement Project." I remember laughing for about 2 seconds, not because anything was funny, but because my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. Water hazard? That pond had been there longer than any house in Willow Creek. My father taught me to cast a fishing line from that dock when I was 12 years old. After I bought the property from him, I rebuilt the dock with my own hands, planted weeping willows along the banks, stocked the water with trout every few years, and watched 3 generations of my family grow up around that little patch of spring-fed water. Every birthday barbecue, every lazy Sunday afternoon, every Christmas when the pond froze solid enough for skating. It all happened right there. My wife, Linda, used to joke that if heaven looked anything like Earth, she'd be sitting on that dock waiting for me with 2 fishing poles. She'd been gone nearly 8 years, but every evening I still found myself wandering down there with a cup of coffee just to listen to the frogs and watch the sunset dance across the water. Now there wasn't even a ripple left, just hot pavement radiating enough heat to blur the air above it. I eventually spotted my neighbor, Walter, standing by his mailbox across the road, and the poor man had that look people get when they know something awful happened but don't know how to tell you. He slowly walked over, took off his cap, and sighed. "Ethan, I tried calling you." "What happened?" I asked, although part of me already knew this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. Walter rubbed the back of his neck. "The HOA hired contractors about 3 weeks after you left. They showed up with excavators, dump trucks, everything. Folks around here kept saying there had to be some mistake because everybody knew that pond belonged to you. The crew said they had authorization from the subdivision board." "Authorization from who?" I asked quietly. "From themselves, apparently." He shook his head. "I even told one of the supervisors he was digging on private property. He just smiled and said the paperwork had all been handled." That sentence stayed with me. The paperwork had all been handled. Whenever somebody says that before touching something they don't own, it usually means the paperwork hasn't been handled at all. Walter handed me a folder he'd been keeping in his garage. Inside were photographs he'd taken while I was away. The first showed bulldozers pushing dirt into the pond. The second showed excavators tearing apart my dock. Another showed workers cutting down every willow tree I'd planted over the years. The last picture stopped me cold. It was my old wooden bench, the one Linda and I built together on our 25th anniversary, tossed into a construction dumpster like broken scrap lumber. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even curse. I just stood there flipping through those photographs while something inside me became incredibly calm, because I'd learned a long time ago that anger makes people sloppy, and the people who had done this were about to discover that I never made important decisions while I was angry. I made them after I started reading paperwork. I spent the rest of that afternoon gathering every piece of evidence I could find before I ever picked up the phone. Walter's photographs went into one folder, The notice they had bolted to my fence went into another, and by sunset, I was sitting at my kitchen table with county maps spread from one end to the other. My father used to tell me that land has a memory if you're willing to read it, and every deed, survey, and easement tells part of that story. I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. I was looking for the truth. The next morning, I drove to the county records office, where an older clerk named Mrs. Hensley recognized my family name before I even introduced myself. She smiled, disappeared into the archive room, and came back carrying a stack of oversized plats tied together with faded blue ribbon. "Your father always kept good records," she said. "Let's see what you've got." We spent nearly 2 hours tracing property lines with our fingertips until something caught both our attention. The entrance road into Willow Creek wasn't owned by the subdivision at all. The developers had negotiated a private easement almost 20 years earlier because the shortest route to the highway crossed the corner of my family's land. They had permission to build and maintain a roadway, but ownership of the ground beneath it had never changed hands. My father had insisted on that language before signing anything, and after he passed away, every one of those rights transferred to me. Mrs. Hensley looked over her glasses and quietly said, "You may want an attorney before you make your next move." That was already the plan. By noon, I was sitting across from Daniel Mercer, a property attorney I'd known for years. He didn't interrupt while I explained everything. He looked through the photographs, studied the easement, leaned back in his chair, and stayed silent for almost a full minute. Finally, he let out a slow whistle. "Ethan, either someone made the biggest mistake I've seen in 25 years, or somebody assumed you wouldn't fight back. Can they really destroy a spring-fed pond on private land?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not legally. And if they authorize construction outside the easement while damaging your improvements, they're standing on very thin ice." Then he tapped one paragraph with his pen. "This is even more interesting. The easement required both parties to avoid interfering with each other's property rights. A material breach by either side could trigger termination proceedings under state law if supported by a court or mutual agreement." Daniel looked up and smiled for the first time that morning. They may have believed they were expanding parking. What they actually did was undermine the agreement that lets everyone drive into that neighborhood. I remember asking him the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind ever since I found the parking lot. "If that easement ends, what happens?" He answered in the calmest voice imaginable. "They'll need another lawful way in, or they'll have to negotiate one." I didn't celebrate. I didn't laugh. I simply nodded because I finally understood why my father had always insisted that paperwork mattered more than loud arguments. Over the next several days, Daniel filed notices preserving my legal claims while I hired an environmental consultant to document what had been lost. The report described the pond as a naturally spring-fed water feature supporting wildlife habitat and groundwater flow. Every willow tree, every section of dock, every improvement I'd made over the years was photographed, measured, and cataloged. We weren't building a dramatic story, we were building evidence. A week later, I sent the HOA board a formal demand letter requesting immediate discussions regarding the destruction of private property and the future of the access easement. 3 days passed without a response. On the 4th day, an envelope finally arrived. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an invitation to talk. It was a letter from the HOA's attorney insisting the board believed the parking expansion had benefited the community and claiming the area had been treated as common space for years. I read it twice before handing it to Daniel. He chuckled, folded it closed, and said, "Well, they just made this much easier." Legal proceedings moved quickly after that. Temporary notices affecting the easement were recorded, contractors scheduled work authorized by the court process, and one bright Friday morning several crews arrived before sunrise. Residents stepped onto their front porches carrying coffee mugs, expecting another ordinary summer day, only to find heavy equipment positioned near the subdivision entrance. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was arguing. Survey stakes marked the property exactly where decades-old maps said they belonged. Workers erected fencing around the construction zone, while traffic control signs redirected vehicles away from the active work area. Confused homeowners rolled down their windows asking what was happening. One foreman politely answered the same question over and over. Access is temporarily restricted while a private property matter is being addressed. Within an hour, the line of waiting vehicles stretched farther than anyone had imagined. Parents called employers to explain they would be late. Delivery trucks turned around. Landscaping crews canceled appointments. Every conversation ended with the same question. Why didn't the HOA warn us? By lunchtime, the board president, Graham Holloway, came storming up my driveway with 2 other board members trailing behind him. His face was bright red before he even reached the porch. "You can't just shut down access because you're upset over a pond," he snapped. I looked at him for a moment before answering. "I'm not upset because of a pond, Graham. I'm upset because your board decided my property belonged to you." He shoved a folder toward me. "This community depends on that road." I gently pushed the folder back across the porch railing. "Then maybe your board should have thought about that before paving over land it didn't own." For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Graham didn't have another sentence ready. He just stood there staring at me while the sound of construction equipment echoed in the distance, and I realized something important. Until that moment, every decision they'd made had been based on one assumption, that I would simply accept whatever they chose to do. They had never prepared for the possibility that the owner of the land might actually know exactly where every property line began and where every legal right ended. By the second week of August, the pressure inside Willow Creek wasn't coming from me anymore. It was coming from the people who actually lived there. Every morning, another line of frustrated homeowners gathered near the construction fencing, some carrying briefcases, others dragging coolers toward the temporary shuttle the county had arranged while the legal dispute continued. Parents were waking up earlier just to get their kids to school. Delivery companies started adding service fees because drivers had to unload packages by the highway. Realtors quietly removed open house signs after one showing after another ended with confused buyers asking the same uncomfortable question. Wait, the neighborhood doesn't actually control its own entrance. Word spread faster than anyone expected. Local newspapers picked up the court filings. Then a regional television station ran a short evening segment explaining that the dispute centered on private property rights, not some neighborly disagreement over landscaping. The camera briefly showed the old photographs Walter had taken before the pond was destroyed, children fishing from the dock, willow trees reflected across the water, then cut to fresh images of the oversized parking lot that had replaced it. Suddenly, the conversation changed. People stopped asking why I was protecting my property and started asking how an HOA board had ever approved the project in the first place. Walter called me after attending one of the homeowners' meetings and laughed before he even finished saying hello. "You should have seen it, Ethan. I've never seen grown adults tear into a board like that." According to him, the clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. Residents demanded financial records, engineering reports, copies of permits, meeting minutes, and legal opinions. One woman stood up and pointed straight at Graham Holloway before saying, "You told us this was an improvement project. You never mentioned it was somebody else's land." Another homeowner asked the question nobody on the board seemed willing to answer. Did anyone verify ownership before spending community money? Silence filled the room. Sometimes silence says more than an argument ever could. A few days later, Daniel called me with the update we'd both been expecting. They're ready to negotiate. We met in a conference room downtown that smelled like fresh coffee and old legal files. Graham looked nothing like the confident man who had stormed onto my porch weeks earlier. His tie was crooked, dark circles hung beneath his eyes, and for the first time since this whole mess began, he sounded less like a board president and more like a tired neighbor carrying the weight of everyone else's anger. "Mr. Carter," he began quietly, "we'd like to reach a settlement before this goes any further." I folded my hands on the table and nodded. "I'm listening." Their attorney presented the first proposal. They offered to remove the unnecessary pavement from my property, restore the pond, rebuild the dock, replace every tree, restock the fish, cover my legal expenses, and pay compensation for the damage. It was a serious offer, one that probably would have impressed most people. I read every page without saying a word. Finally, Graham asked, "Well?" I closed the folder and slid it gently back across the table. "You're offering to replace things you destroyed," I replied. "That's expected, but you still haven't explained why you believed you had the right to destroy them in the first place." Nobody answered. The room fell completely still. Daniel finally broke the silence by placing another agreement on the table. "If we're resolving this," he said, "our client requires permanent protections." The revised document established a completely new right-of-way agreement with annual compensation for continued roadway access across my property, mandatory insurance requirements, strict maintenance obligations, independent boundary surveys every few years, and language making it unmistakably clear that no future board could alter, enter, improve, or disturb any portion of my land without written permission. It also required the HOA to acknowledge, in writing, that the previous construction had exceeded its authority. Graham slowly read each page before looking up at me. "This is going to be expensive," I answered as calmly as I could. "So was replacing 30 years of memories with asphalt." He looked down again, sighed, and picked up his pen. One by one, the remaining board members signed beside his name. There was no dramatic speech, no celebration, no handshake for the cameras. Just the quiet scratching of ink across paper as the people who had ignored property lines finally accepted them. The following spring, restoration finally began. The unnecessary pavement on my land was removed piece by piece. Heavy equipment carefully excavated the compacted soil until the old spring slowly pushed its way back to the surface. It wasn't instant. Nature rarely works on our schedule. But week after week, the basin filled again. Volunteers from a local conservation group even helped plant young willow trees along the shoreline. When I released the first bucket of trout into the water, I stood there smiling longer than I probably should have. It wasn't because everything had been restored exactly as it had been before. It hadn't. Some things can never truly be replaced. It was because the place finally felt alive again. A few weeks later, my youngest granddaughter sat beside me on the new dock with a fishing pole almost taller than she was. She watched the ripples spread across the water before asking, "Grandpa, was it really worth fighting this hard?" I looked across the pond as the evening sun reflected off the surface exactly the way it used to decades earlier. "It was never just about the pond," I told her. "If people can decide your property belongs to them simply because it's convenient, they'll keep deciding until somebody reminds them where the line is." She thought about that for a moment, nodded, and smiled as a trout tugged gently on her line. Looking back now, I don't think anyone truly won. The homeowners lost months of peace because of decisions they never voted on. The HOA board lost the trust of the people they were supposed to represent. I lost a place filled with memories that could never be perfectly recreated. But maybe there was one lesson worth keeping. Respecting another person's property isn't just about following the law. It's about respecting the life they built there long before you arrived. I'd really like to hear where you stand on this. If you had been in my shoes, would you have accepted the settlement, or would you have taken the case all the way through trial? And if you had lived in that subdivision, would you have blamed the board, the contractors, or everyone involved? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this rarely have simple answers. If you enjoyed this fictional story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves legal drama, property disputes, and stories where patience ends up being far more powerful than anger.